So Boyd, it's been about 6 months since we released the Lancet Commission report on the syndemic, the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. What's been the biggest surprise and the most compelling takeaway that you have from that release in the last 6 months?
Well, I have to say I was quite worried at the outset that we weren't going to take three big problems and make them into such a gigantic problem that people would just say pack their bags and go home, say this is too big. But I was pleasantly surprised, I have to say, that I think it resonated very clearly with people. They got the idea, they got the story, and I think it landed on what people had been thinking about but not articulating. So I think we gave voice to that general feeling. And I found, particularly in the food space, it's been a great way to engage with others from other disciplines from where I come from, in the undernutrition space and in the climate change space.
Yeah. No, I think it's been a really nice unifying concept, and we didn't know very much about syndemics until 2 years ago.
That's right.
And I think that my surprise has been how that people get it. They get this notion of interacting pandemics, each of which makes the other worse, and holds the promise of triple duty solutions.
Have common drivers.
Common drivers that could be addressed in these systems, the food system, the urban design, land use, and transport systems. That they get that. And I think our challenge is breaking down the silos between those and selling the syndemic to each of these groups and hopefully unifying their initiatives.
Yeah. So we did have those four big systems: the food system, transport, urban design, and land use. But probably it's fair to say that the food systems in the last 6 months or something has come to the fore, with other reports coming out. I mean, how are you viewing that at the moment, these joining together at the food system level?
Well, I think that's where a lot of action is. And there's less action on the urban design, land use, transport systems, which is a bit ironic because the health effects of the food system are not as visible as the health effects of mal-design of urban transport, where in a city like Beijing, you can see it and you're affected by it. You know your breathing is difficult. That if you have asthma, you have an asthma attack, you go to the ER. Whereas the consequences of the food systems are downstream a little more. I mean, in terms of cancer, obesity, those kinds of things, which you don't see right away.
Downstream, but people still eat every day. They feel that food is their domain and they have an opinion on it, and I think that makes it much more amenable to action from people if they see what they're eating actually does affect not only their health but also the climate.
Right, so that's the promise. So the promise is that people will see the connection between their meat consumption and climate change, and that recognize that the demand for meat is actually driving climate change. So by reducing the demand for meat in terms of their own personal consumption habits, they may actually be contributing to mitigation of climate change. The other area that I think is a recent insight on our part is that not all of this is about climate change. So that, for example, corn production, which drives high fructose corn syrup and soda, is very environmentally degrading. It's not climate change, but it's environmental degradation as a consequence of its water use, pesticide use, herbicide use, which wash downstream in the Mississippi River to create a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that's as large as the state of New Jersey. So how do we get people to recognize that their consumption of soda is actually an environmental hazard and with its own consequences?
Well, I think that's right, and we do have to kind of resonate with people. And I think one of the other things that I've found that people get is this idea of policy inertia that we put out there, that we're not getting any action because of the pushback from industry, because of a reluctance of government to regulate and tax, and a lack of demand from civil society, from NGOs, from professional organisations, from citizens and so on. And I see that as the sleeping giant, that if we can awaken that, then we can engage citizens in demanding action. So this is a little bit of a different take from how people have seen individual responsibility before. We thought about it as, I'm responsible for what I put in my mouth, but actually I'm not only a person here for myself, but I'm a person for society and the planet, and I have interactions with my family, with the schools, with the workplace, as a voter, in the supermarket, and we can influence each of those environments just as those environments are influencing us.
But the trick is how to engage people in that.
Yeah.
Right? Because civil society is not going to move unless society is pushing it to move. And so I think this comes back to personalizing the issue of climate change and the driving individual behavior change and as a way of increasing demand and influencing civil society. But I think part of the thing that I felt, the other takeaway that I had, was a much greater sense of urgency following our report, and that recognizing that we don't have a lot of time before we don't have a lot of time before the sleeping giant awakens or needs to awaken, and so we better set the alarm now.
We better set that alarm
for 10 years from now, because if it doesn't happen by then, we're going to burn up.
Well, that's why we suggested this great intergenerational food transformation. You know, how can this generation, this generation that has the power within one generation, in other words, before 2050, create sustainable, healthy, equitable, prosperous food systems for future generations. So we need to articulate it in that way. And I think the school strikes are an example of mobilization of citizenry to demand policy action. So maybe some parts of the sleeping giant are awakening already.
Well, and one of my favorite recommendations from our report was that we adopted the Iroquois notion of planning for the seventh generation.
Yes.
That we're so short-sighted on some of these changes and some of these demands, but we really have to think out 7 generations hence.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, yeah.